Okay, so tonight I want to think with you about the original title I gave to Colleen was Kings, Puritans, and England's Strange Reformation. I thought as I looked on that was not very fair or wasn't true to reality, so it's changed to Kings, Queens, and Puritans, because Queens have a very important part in the story that we're going to think about tonight. Only one or two of us were brought up in countries where the history of England was what you were required to learn in school. And so as I was going through all of this material, it brought back lots of memories of being thoroughly bored trying to keep all different kings and different events and the House of York and the House of Lancaster and the War of the Roses and all of those kind of things straight in my mind, which had no particular relevance to the way I live. At least I didn't think at the time, and the way they taught it, it didn't. But in fact, what we're going to think about tonight does. So the English Reformation is different than any of the others, in that the other parts where Reformation took place, there was a Christian leader who stood out, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, and we could go on and talk about individuals. Now, last week we spent our time talking about William Tyndale, and the English Bible. At least I'm consistent. I get it wrong every time. And so clearly Tyndale had a significant part in all of that, and there were others as well, going back to John Wycliffe and then the Lollards, and then there was a group of others. But the Reformation in one sense happens in England top down. And it really concerns the royal family. So we're going to think about it related to the royal family. So first of all, you have a kind of constitutional reformation in terms of the laws. And then you have a theological reformation that comes in underneath that, and then it spins out in a number of different ways. So what we're going to talk about is to trace the history of the English royalty at this particular time, and particularly four figures that become important, two kings and two queens. So we begin with Henry VIII, who is known for lots of different things. He was actually a pretty gifted man in lots of ways, but power corrupts. There was an interesting article that I was reading this morning that power can become a kind of mental disease. And certainly it had that effect on Henry in different ways. But just to talk about something about his family background. He was the son of Henry VII, which isn't surprising if his name is Henry VIII. But there's more to the story. Henry VII was the one. There'd been a long battle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster about who was going to be the royal family. And Henry VII defeated Richard III, for any of you who took some Shakespeare along the way, and launched now a new royal dynasty that had some links to the past, the Tudors, Tudor. So Henry VII is the first Tudor king. But he comes to the throne, and England is not especially a power at that particular time, and his great concern is to secure the dynasty, and one of the ways of doing that is to get connection to some of the great powers. Spain was the greatest power at that particular time, and the European powers. So he, in 1502, married his son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon. Now, you may not think of Catherine of Aragon, but you'll probably understand some of the connection if you remember that her parents were Ferdinand and Isabella. And if you think of Ferdinand and Isabella, you think of Christopher Columbus and all that happened in that particular way. That's the great power of Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella represented two Spanish royal families that were brought together at that particular point. So Arthur is the king designate. He's married. He's made this matrimonial diplomacy kind of marriage, not love, diplomacy, state power. But 5 months after they're married, Arthur dies. And now Henry VII is very concerned because the dowry is involved and the political prestige is involved. And so now his goal is to marry his next son to Catherine. Catherine is also the aunt of Charles V, who becomes the Holy Roman Empire. He's the emperor. He's the one, you remember, at the Diet of Worms that Luther had to deal with. So he was 19 at that particular time, but at this point he's younger than that. And so what he does is marry Henry to Catherine. But there's a problem, because the book of Leviticus, chapter 20 and verse 21 says, a brother may not take his brother's sister as his wife. They had to get a special papal dispensation. And they had to go to the Pope for permission to have this take place because they'd been married. Now, Catherine claimed that the marriage had never been consummated, but nobody was quite convinced of that. So he gets a special papal dispensation. And in 1509, he comes to the throne and he begins to rule. And one of his great concerns is, just like his father's, to protect the dynasty. So he and Catherine are married, and as they go through marriage, she gets pregnant several times along the way. She is 7 years older than him, and she has 5 daughters. But only one of the daughters survives infancy, a daughter named Mary. And so Charles is having concerns about this as it goes on. As I said, he's enthroned on April the 21st, 1509. And Henry is, at this point, a zealous Catholic. With the help of some of his courtiers, he will write a book rebutting Martin Luther. And Martin Luther's book in 1521 called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And attacking Luther, he will write a book, which sells fairly well because kings don't usually write books on theology, called A Defense of the Seven Sacraments. And in response to that, the Pope will give him a special title, Defender of the Faith. Now, the interesting thing, that's still a title that the British monarchy has, and it's an interesting issue going into Elizabeth's Charles, the present Elizabeth II's Charles, who is in line to become the king, says he will not allow himself to be called Defender of the Faith. He would be willing to be called Defender of Faith, because he's not in any way a Christian, and that kind of fits into the whole ethos. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Well, so he has this. He's sided with a cardinal named Cardinal Wolsey, and they are pursuing Catholicism strongly. Wolsey is not only the cardinal, the archbishop, but he is also made the chancellor, which is the second highest position politically in the land under the king. So he has state power and he has political power. And he is preventing, as we had, the Bible from being printed and forcing Tyndale to go over to the country. But in 1526, by 1526, Henry is very anxious about the fact he doesn't have a male heir. And Catherine has given him one child, a daughter, and for 7 years she hasn't been pregnant. She had those 4 early on. They've been married now for considerable length of time, 16 years or something of that length of time. And she's over 40. He doesn't think she's going to get pregnant again, and he wants a male heir. One of the significant parts of that is that there had been queens that had come to the throne in England, or at least been eligible for the throne, every time there was a civil war. And England's just gone through a civil war. So part of his concern is a male heir, and there's a certain amount of altruism on it, of wanting to preserve the country. But the other side is he's got his eye on a young woman, a 20-year-old named Anne Boleyn. He's already had an affair with her sister. And Anne has Reformation beliefs, actually, even though they're somewhat hidden. And she will not accede to just having an affair with him, and he wants to marry her. So he orders Wolsey, the archbishop, to appeal to the Pope, and to appeal to the Pope for an annulment of the marriage. And Henry has picked on this. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, forbids me from marrying my brother's sister, my brother's wife, and that is perhaps why God has cursed me for this. And it wasn't a legitimate marriage. It shouldn't have taken place. I want it annulled. And the Pope, this is now a new Pope. This is Pope Julius, I think, a second. And Pope Julius is caught. I'm not sure I've got the name of the particular Pope right. No, it's Clement the Seventh. So there's a kind of issue here about, well, if popes don't heir, how can we annul a marriage that he gave a thing for? But what really had happened is 1527, the Spanish king their troops had come down and swept through the papal states and had ransacked Rome. And Clement VII was virtually a prisoner of Charles V. And Charles V isn't going to allow him to declare his aunt being married illegitimate. So that's a no-go. That won't happen at that particular time, at least he's told that. And Henry's not content with that. He keeps pressuring and keeps pressuring and keeps pressuring, and then finally he decides, no, that's enough. He's going to depose Wolsey and behead him for not doing his business, but Wolsey dies before that, and he names other counselors. One of them, a man named Thomas Cranmer, and another one named Thomas Cromwell. Now those were, especially Cromwell, was part of a group at Cambridge who'd come in touch with Lutheran ideas. And there's a circle of them. We'd mentioned that Tyndale was one of those, and then there's several others. They'll pop up in the story. Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, Miles Coverdale, we talked about last week, related to the Bible. John Rogers, the person who did the Matthew's Bible. And as I said last week, Tyndale was probably part of that particular group. Well, Cromwell's one of those. And Thomas Cranmer, so there's two very similar names, Cromwell and Cranmer. They're both Thomases, and they're in now the picture. And Henry gets to know Cranmer, and Cranmer suggests to him the idea that he could break away from the Roman Church and just name himself the head of the church. And he could probably arrange a way in which, first of all, he said, what we need to do is canvass the universities of Europe. Is it right for Henry to be married to Catherine, or should the marriage be annulled? And they send out this request for decisions of the university faculties, and they come back divided. Now, the fact that any of them said, no, you could go ahead and do it, is all Henry needs to do it. And Cranmer is named archbishop, so he can railroad this through. And he's concerned about Reformation, and he's looking for ways to do it. I'm not sure at what point he truly was genuinely converted, but at least he was convinced of these ideas. At this particular time, he'd married secretly. He was a priest who'd married secretly the wife of a major reformer over in Europe. It's interesting, the deviance you get into when you go against biblical things like, and produce celibacy. Anyway, he arranges it. He gets a group of English bishops to come together in a council, and they decree that that Henry's marriage to Catherine is not a legitimate marriage. And that decree comes in May of 1533. Henry knew it was coming, so he married Anne Boleyn in January. Private marriage. Publicly, the former marriage is dissolved, which means Catherine is now scandalous, and Mary, his daughter, and this becomes important, is now an illegitimate child. So she's now got a name attached to her because of this. And so in June of that year, they are married. And in September of that year, their daughter is born, Elizabeth. So we've got Mary and we've got Elizabeth. My wife's name is Mary Elizabeth. I don't know. I don't think your mother was thinking of them. I think it was probably Luke that she was thinking of, and not Henry. But at this point, Henry declares himself the head of the church. So in 1534, he, as it were, divorces the Pope. He pushes Parliament to make two acts. The first one is called the Act of Succession. And the Act of Succession declares that the children of Henry and Anne are to be considered the heirs to the throne. And the second is the Act of Supremacy. And the Act of Supremacy is Henry is then appointed to be, quote, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So now for the first time you have a third church. You had the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, the Church of England. He hasn't changed the theology. He basically believes what he believed as a Catholic, except the Pope is not the supreme head. He makes it illegal to send money to the church. The money that you were supposed to send to Rome, you now send to him, which is rather convenient in that particular way. And he appoints bishops who are supportive of his particular position, and some that object too much. And one of the ones who's really been an opponent, we talked about this last week, was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More, about whom the movie was made, The Man for All Seasons, and he was a brilliant scholar, but he was a fierce Catholic in the Erasmus style. And he did everything he could to get hold of Tyndale, but he didn't. And when Henry declared himself no longer under the Pope, but the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, More couldn't take anymore. And so Henry put him in prison and then executed him around the same time that Tyndale was being executed over in Belgium. So now you have something new. We have the Church of England, which is a Catholic church, but not a Roman Catholic church. It's an English Catholic church. And in 1536, Henry goes one step further and he seizes all the church's properties, all the monasteries, and the money that's in the monasteries. Now, in our terms, that doesn't sound very much, but it's estimated that 1/10 of the wealth of England was held by the monasteries and 30% of the land. So to seize all of that and to make it his own, and he takes it obviously to get money for himself, but he also uses the land and the money as bribes to the aristocracy to go along with what he's doing, because They want the land and they want the money too. So you can see this is not exactly a theological, I've been reading my Bible and God has convinced me of the truth of justification by faith. It is a purely political maneuvering and a power grab in this particular way. He also, at that point, commands that an English Bible be put in all the churches, put in there, chained, and it is to be read in English, the Great Bible. This is only a couple of years after Tyndale's been murdered at the thing of the Bishop of London for wanting to have the Bible in English. Now Henry's put it in the churches, but he also publishes the 6 Articles of Faith in that same time, 1539, and they reaffirm transubstantiation, communion in one form. In other words, you have the bread, but you can't take the cup. Confession, purgatory, celibacy for the clerisy, the clergy, and all of those kind of things. And in 1538 now, he is excommunicated by the Pope. So there's a strong divorce at this particular time. Now, speaking of divorce, Anne doesn't give him any boys. And he gets upset at that particular thing. And after a few years go by, she doesn't look quite as pretty as she once did. In 1536, she is accused of adultery and beheaded. She was almost certainly not guilty of adultery. What she was guilty of was not having produced an heir for Henry. So Henry, 11 days after he's beheaded, Anne Boleyn marries Jane Seymour. And Lady Jane Seymour gets pregnant and gives birth to Edward in 1537. But then she goes and dies 12 days later of complications of childbirth, which wasn't unusual at that particular time. So Edward is still looking for someone. So he marries Henry is still looking for someone, so he marries Catherine Howard. She's 19, and by this time, Henry he used to be an athlete. Now, he's lived an indulgent life, and the pictures you see of pudgy King Henry, porky King Henry, she is repulsed by his obesity, and he smells bad. And he smells bad because he's got an open abscess on his leg that can't be cured. And so she begins to play around, is caught in an affair, and she is beheaded. So that's one divorce, one death, and 2 beheadings at this point in his history. Somebody suggests to him that he should make a kind of connection with some of the Protestant areas in Europe. And so a marriage is arranged with him with a woman named Anne of Cleves. She's a Protestant, a daughter of a Protestant aristocrat, but the marriage is sight unseen. So he's married, but he's never seen her. And when he sees her, he's repulsed by her and refuses to do anything else, and the marriage is annulled. Interestingly, she goes on to become a pretty good friend of his and stays in England. And then finally, in 1543, he marries a woman named Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr almost gets executed because she is flirting with Protestantism, with Reformed ideas. And a group accuse her of that, but she manages to convince Henry that it isn't really so, but it is so. And she is in charge of the education of Henry's son, Edward. And she arranges for Edward to have Reformed tutors who come over from Europe and are teaching him God's word and God's truth, even though he's a young boy at this particular time. So another thing is going on, and I know this is all getting very complex. But what you've had is Henry has said we're no longer Roman Catholic. And you've got people in the court who are determined Roman Catholics. And you've got another group who, like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, are reformed. And they're both plotting behind the scenes to see who can win. And there's sort of this battle going on behind. And in the midst of that, and this will come up again, in the midst of that, Henry dies. And he dies in, 1547.
January 20th, 1547.
Thank you for reading that, Connor. Don't want anybody to think that you've memorized it. So I don't know whether there's anything to, well, let's go on and we'll talk about the next one, then we can come back. So Edward comes to the throne. Edward's 9 years of age, and he's a rather sickly boy. But he's under the guardianship of, and his motives are not clear, but he's under the guardianship of someone who's determined to push Reformation ideas. And so they begin to push Reformation ideas. He is being taught by people who are believing in the Reformation, and he himself comes to believe it. When he's 13, he writes a long article against the Pope, calling him an Antichrist and all of these other kinds of things. And he has strong theological convictions at this point. Even as a 13-year-old boy, you can ask how many of them are his own and how many of them have been poured into him. But in that opportunity, Thomas Cranmer, who'd been the archbishop, and he managed to stay alive despite what Henry was doing to others, putting them to death, such as Thomas Cromwell, he steps to the fore, and now he begins to promote strong Reformation ideas. And so he produces a Book of Common Prayer in 1549. The Book of Common Prayer was a series of services as they were to be held that preachers and priests were to follow. The first one is kind of it was Catholic with some of the Catholicism taken out of it. But in 1552, he produces the Book of Common Prayer, which in basic form is still the Book of Common Prayer, and it's very Calvinist in its theology, with some accommodations made. It is strongly biblical, and if you talk to some convinced Anglicans today, they will want to go back to the Book of Common Prayer, like John Stott and James Packer and these others. They resonate with the theology that's taught there. So this is a very different than, and he also produced what are called the 49 Articles of the Church, which is a statement of faith. Again, very Calvinistic in its form. And so he produces that. He produces something called the homilies, because he thought the priests, they don't know what to preach, they don't know their Bibles, so he produces a book of sermons to be preached by preachers in churches on justification by faith and the authority of Scripture. So the homilies are there, and these things are going on, and England is certainly coming under a strong influence of these things. He also imports some of the Reformed theologians, Martin Bucer and Peter Martyr Vermigli from Italy, and they are teaching in that particular place. And there's a series of laws undoing Catholicism. So, under Henry, you had English Catholicism. Now you have English, increasingly biblical theology. And then at the age of 16, he dies of pneumonia. Now, what happens then is, on one level, tragic, but there's a debate over who. Obviously, the next major candidate is Mary, who is a legitimate child, well, had been a legitimate child of Henry VIII, Catherine's daughter. But they know that she's inclined to Catholicism for several reasons, and so they try to sneak in somebody who's a grandniece of Henry VIII, a teenage girl, 16 years of age or 17 years of age, known as Lady Jane Grey. And Lady Jane is, again, a remarkably well-trained biblical Christian at this particular time. And they get Parliament to name her as queen, and she reigns, but there's a popular sentiment that this is not right. This is not the way things are done. She does not have legitimacy. And Mary gathers people around her, and they sweep in, and Lady Jane Grey is put under arrest, and she is put in the Tower of London, and she is sentenced to be executed. At the age of 7, she's turned 17 in the Tower of London. And there's interesting dialogue that comes. Mary sends in the Archbishop to try and convince her. And I don't know where it comes from, but you can read this dialogue between Lady Jane Grey and the Archbishop as they argue about justification by faith. And quite frankly, this teenage girl walks all over the Archbishop theologically until he gets frustrated and leaves, but has come to be impressed with her. But she's executed at that particular time. And now Mary comes to the throne. So Mary the First, also known historically. In your notes, I just put, Edward is often called the young Josiah, because if you remember Josiah in the Old Testament, the boy who comes to the throne, and there's a revival, think of him in that way. Lady Jane Grey is a kind of sacrificial lamb. And now you have Bloody Mary. She comes to the throne, and she is a determined Catholic. That's one side of it. And she is determined to make the people who did what they did to her mother pay. And what they did to her, because she was declared an illegitimate child because of what she had done. And she comes to the throne and immediately tries to undo everything that Edward basically had done, and also Henry had done. She is vindicating her mother's humiliation. She forced Parliament to repeal all of Edward's actions, making Protestantism a heresy. Now, most people at this time were probably still Catholic because they'd always been Catholic, and there hadn't been time for this to reach very far down, although there's a lot of Protestants that are present. I'm reading a novel which has a kind of mixed value to it on this particular period of history. I didn't know it was until I started reading it, and it's interesting, talk about the play back and forth between Catholics, and I just was reading this afternoon the part where Elizabeth is named queen instead of Mary, and all of the tensions that are involved in there. But now Protestantism is a heresy. A month before, it had been the new wave of the way things were going. But she makes a mistake, and she marries Philip II of Spain. Again, Spain's the most powerful country in the world, and she marries Philip. But the thought that you would marry a foreign king gives you a thought that, well, that means probably that Philip will be the king. If Mary's the queen, he will be the king, and we do not want a foreign king, whatever else. And so that made her significantly unpopular. But what happens at this stage is 800 bishops and priests flee over to Europe. And they go over to Europe where they can carry out Reformation. Many of them go to Geneva. They go to different places such as Wittenberg, and they begin to see other churches functioning in different ways, and they encounter that the Geneva Bible, which we talked about last time, is printed in this time. But Mary strikes out to rid the people of those who stay. And Fox's Book of Martyrs is written during this time. John Fox is one of the ones who ran away. 300 at least are martyred during that particular time. And Fox's Book of Martyrs institutionalizes this. Elizabeth and Morgan were in London in June. And then they went up to Oxford. And Oxford is known for 3 martyrdoms that occurred there. In one of them, it was in March of 1555, October 1555. Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, both of them were bishops, and they were committed to the faith. And there's a place where you can see, it's in the middle of the road, I think now. Traffic is going over it, but it's still a marker there of the very place they were executed. And that one becomes well known because Latimer turned to Ridley as they were being put at the stake and said, "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle that by God's grace it will never be put out." And those words, when they were given around the kind of resonated with a lot, and all kinds had sympathy on this particular place. About 6 months later, Thomas Cranmer was made to watch this, and she had a special hatred for Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer was the archbishop who'd arranged that the marriage of her mother was annulled. So she was going to get back at him. And she arrested him, had him put in the tower, and he was put through all kinds of torture and other kinds of things, and he recanted. He recanted the faith. As a matter of fact, he recanted the faith 6 different times under the pressures of the persecution that were given. But still, usually if you recant, you save your life. Mary's not going to let him get away with it. And he is put to the stake and to be burned in Oxford in March. But as he stands there, he publicly recants his recantation. Said, I was wrong, I didn't say what I ought to say, and his words were specifically, did it publicly. Then they started to light it, and as he was there, he stuck his hand out first, and he said, I have sinned in that I signed with my hand what I did not believe in my heart, and my hand must go in the fire first. And so that became the way he died. He was 70 years old, or almost 70 at the time, and that led to more revulsion against this. And then Mary took stomach cancer and died. So now you've got another battle, but this one is cleared up fairly quickly, and Elizabeth I is now the queen. Have I lost you in all of these maneuvers here? So we've got 2 kings and 2 queens with Lady Jane Grey for 9 days in between. And Elizabeth is a Protestant. There's no doubt that she's a Protestant, but she's also committed to tolerance, and she's committed not to polarize situations. She's She's shrewd and she's skilled, and she's very gifted at double talk. And she's a very persuasive individual. She will be the longest reigning queen until Queen Victoria. And then Queen Victoria has just been beaten by Elizabeth II. It's interesting, the 3 longest reigning people in England are all women. Whatever that says about things, I don't know. So she comes to the throne in 1558, and in 1559, she has Parliament pass an Act of Supremacy. And the Act of Supremacy declares that Elizabeth, or the monarch, is the only supreme governor, slight change of term, for Henry, it was the supreme head on church. This was the only supreme governor of the realm in spiritual and ecclesiastical as well as temporal matters. So from that time on, theoretically, the monarch is the head of the church in England. And up until 1952, I think, or maybe even more recently than that, Bishops and archbishops are appointed in England by the Queen with the consent of the government. Now that's changed somewhat, but up until very recently, the church didn't control its own affairs. The way it works in England more recently is the Queen's a bit of a figurehead, but nevertheless, she has power in those particular ways. But then in 1559 also, there was the Act of Uniformity that was pronounced. And that was that the Book of Common Prayer was to be used in all services in England. And she reinstitutes the 42 articles, only she knocks off the last 3, and they become the 39 articles. So the Book of Common Prayer, which basically is Thomas Cranmer, and the 39 articles, which are basically Thomas Cranmer, are the abiding legal basis for Episcopal churches around the world, theoretically. And that's precisely what's going on now, because you see what's happening in the United States Episcopal Church has turned their back on those things a long time ago, but the churches in Africa and in South America and in the East, Singapore and Malaysia, they genuinely believe the 39 articles and the theology of the Book of Common Prayer. So they are turning in rebellion against the Anglican Church. And so, and the Anglican Church in the United States, the Episcopalian Church is dividing because all kinds are leaving the Episcopalian Church and they're becoming Anglican churches. And we can talk another time about how that works, because it means that they come under the authority of a bishop in Nigeria or some other country, Rwanda. Now, there is now a state church. I see the date that I was looking for. Until 2007, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prime Minister chose bishops and other pastors. That's 10 years ago that lasted until. In 1570, the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth and releases all her subjects from loyalty to her. And then in 1588, the Spanish Armada tries to invade and England defeats them. So now England becomes the most dominant power in the world at that particular time, or at least in the Western world. But here's where things begin to change. The 800 who'd been in Europe come back. And as they come back, now there's an Anglican church, and we can call it that, the Church of England, an Anglican church. And you are to be related to the Anglican church. But it's pretty, Elizabeth has chosen what's called the Via Media, the middle road. It's genuinely Protestant, and yet you've got high church Anglicans and you've got low church Anglicans. Some who are almost Catholic in the rituals they want to do, and others that are very different. And these people have come back from Geneva and other places, and they say, oh, there's way too much Catholic junk still here. And we've got to purify the church of this. We've got to make this right, and we've got to have a biblical church. And they've also been in a place where the churches aren't run from a hierarchy from Westminster or Lambeth Palace, but they are local congregations. And so they come back, and a group of them will come into the church and want to purify it. And they are called Puritans, because they want to purify the existing church. Others will say, the church needs to be purified, but this structure is not appropriate. And so they become outside the church, separatists. So you've got Puritans within the church working to purify it, and you've got separatists from outside saying, it can't be purified. Let's start and work on a biblical basis at that particular time. And so Elizabeth does not like this. She wants her rule to be confined, or to be all embracing. So in 1598, I think it is, she passes a law that is the anti-Puritan law. The law against the Puritans is what it's called, to say it is illegal to have church services anywhere but a Catholic church, to have communion, an Anglican church, to have communion anywhere but an Anglican church. And so that brings us sort of to this point. We've got a Reformed church that's not really Reformed. And so then we now move to the second stage, and that's the next 100 years. But I know I've worn you out with all of that. Let's just see if you have any questions about it, or whether it's just got a buzz in your head.
So with the Common Book of Prayer and
Book of Common Prayer.
Book of Common Prayer and the sermons that they're supposed to be preaching, sounds like Common Core for the church?
Well, the Book of Common Prayer is more than that. It is the liturgy that if you went into a church today that was following this closely, it is all written there, and you go through that, and there are prescribed things that you say, and there's times you stand, and there's times you kneel, and you do all of those. So it is a liturgical statement. There's other parts in it that are prayers to be said at certain points and under certain circumstances. So it's not, I mean, it's a much more proscribed kind of thing than that. And what you're to preach on particular days, there's a lectionary that often goes with it. So the homilies were an attempt to make sure there was biblical preaching going on by, they could at least read a sermon that was theological, Cranmer thought, even if they didn't understand any of the theology. So, okay, so let's talk briefly about the Puritans because, well, they're somewhat important and there's a kind of history here. So what happens now has 4 different kind of periods, and I go through them relatively quickly, but some of this becomes history that you will know in ways that I don't. The Puritans, H.L. Mencken once said about Puritans are people who have a haunting fear that someone somewhere is having a good time. And that's the kind of parody of what they are. Or Lord Macaulay said, the Puritans hated bear baiting, which was kind of a game. You have a bear on a chain and you baited it and tried to get it fighting at you. The Puritans hated bear baiting, not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave great pleasure to the spectators. So they're viewed as killjoys and all of these other things, but that bears little resemblance, no, that's a bad term. That has little resemblance to the reality of what's going on. So we had stage 1, and stage 1 is the Elizabethan period, this first attempt to purify the church. And so you have 2 groups, basically. You have the insiders and you have the outsiders. So you have or what they're called often, the conformists and the nonconformists, or the Anglicans and the separatists. I mean, within the Puritans. These are people, strong biblical theological viewpoints, moderately Calvinist in their understanding of what these things are. And then in 1598, they get the Act Against the Puritans, 1593, I'm sorry, imprisoned Puritans who didn't attend church. So then Elizabeth finally dies in 1603. And in 1603, and we talked about this last week, James I comes to the throne. There's a whole kind of thing of why James I. He's not obviously related to Henry, except in a distant way. He's a Stuart, won't get into all of that English stuff. But now you have the Stuart kings. James the First comes. He has been James the Sixth of Scotland, and now he's James the First of England. And as he's coming to reign in 1603, a group of Puritans came to him and gave him a list of things that they thought that he ought to do. And he looked up and said, my goal is to harry you, to chase you out of England, which wasn't a really encouraging start. So in 1604, he meets and makes it very clear that in his opinion, no bishop, no king. What that means is, if I don't have bishops, if I don't have a hierarchy, there won't be any reason for a king. So episcopacy, bishops, this structured church, monarchy and episcopacy go hand in hand, which they do. You've got in both cases these kind of structures, and he's making it very clear not having anything to do with this Puritan stuff. And yet he agrees to have a Bible translation, and so we have the King James Version. But this whole discussion factionalizes into two groups. So now you have a different battle. You have one group who are the royalists, and you have another group who are the Puritans. One group is concerned to protect the monarchy. The other group is to try and reform the church and have the church be what it's meant to be. The King James Version was an attempt by King James to minimize the influence of the Geneva Bible, because that was the Puritans' Bible. So it was not pure in its motivation or in its direction at that particular time. So he also didn't have much use for Parliament, so he dismissed Parliament and imposed a high church on the Church of England with many rituals at that point. Now, he dies in 1642, and he is...
1624.
Pardon?
It's 1624, not.
1625, I'm sorry. And Charles I comes to the throne, and he is a rather weak man, but he doesn't think anything about Parliament either. And kings, he says, are little gods. So he's playing the divine right of king's law, and we'll come back and see some of the relevance of this in just a minute. And he puts in place an archbishop called Archbishop William Laud, L-A-U-D, who is fanatically anti-Puritan, anti-biblical, fanatically high church at this particular time. And yet in the middle of this, Charles decides he's going to take on the Scots. The Scots have Presbyterian rule, and he wants them to become Episcopal and change the whole rule and come under this. That leads to revolt in Scotland, the Covenanters, it's called, the League of the Covenant, and they take up arms against the king. And that's going to spread down south, and we're going to have civil war. But what else is going on during this time? Well, when James comes in and says, I'm going to harry you out of the country, a bunch of them decide again to leave. These are the, sort of like the group that had been there before. And in 1609, a group of them goes to Holland, and they will have their own experience. And you know this story much better than I do. I didn't have to learn it in school and get it all through. But they become the Mayflower Pilgrims. So there's one group of Puritans that comes in 1620 in the Mayflower, and then there's the Massachusetts Bay Colony that's 1630. Those come out of Puritans who've left the country and gone to Holland to try and find respite and a place where they can have religious freedom to do their own thing. So King James, this is what I find it so amusing when people who are pro-King James and they're fervent Baptists realize that King James was not an enemy to the faith. He hated it. Now another group go over to Holland, and they become Baptist as they study the Bible. And so the first Baptist church is in Holland in around that same period of time. Again, a group of refugees, and then some of them come back to England, and that's where Baptist churches begin at this period of time. So 20,000, it's estimated, Puritan-minded people in this time leave for the United States. Not the United States, the 13 colonies, but you understand what I'm saying. So the roots of this country are what happened in all of this, that Queen Mary chased people to Europe who got biblical theology, who came back, and then under Elizabeth had a breathing time, and then James puts the screws on, and then you have the movement out to England. Now you've got so Charles has fought the Scots, and he's got to get help, so he calls Parliament back. He hasn't had Parliament in for years, and he turns to them for support, and half of them are not willing to support him. And Parliament splits down the middle. So you've got on one side the Royalists, the Cavaliers as they call themselves, and you've got on the other side the Puritans, and they're made up of Congregationalists, who are people who are outside the Church of England, independent group, Presbyterians, influenced by Scotland up north, and others in the country. And Oliver Cromwell begins to become the leader at this point. There's a civil war. Charles is beheaded, and you have no monarchy, and you have the Commonwealth set up with Oliver Cromwell, who's a genuine believer, as the Lord Protector. But these groups have been fighting so long to get their way that when they have their way, they can't stop fighting with each other. And so these Christian groups are fighting just like they did over in Europe. So you have Luther and you have Zwingli and Calvin, and they all get into theological battles. Well, that's what happened during this period of time, until finally people got so fed up with that they said, a king's better than this. And even the Presbyterians wanted a king. And so Oliver Cromwell dies, his son takes over as Lord Protector. He can't do it, he retires. And so you have Charles II called back. And Charles II is instituted as the king, and the restoration takes place. And the Cavaliers, Charles II is a person, well, you can get something of his moral character in that he's estimated to have 14 illegitimate children. So he's good time Charles. But he's not good time Charles. In 1662, there's the Act of Uniformity, and that required loyalty to the Book of Common Prayer to hold office in church or in government, or compulsory to attend university. And that produces what's called the Great Ejection. 2,000 clergymen who are Bible-believing clergymen are kicked out of their pulpits. All non-Anglican churches are made illegal. The Conventicles Act is passed, which forbids a group of more than 5 people who are not related by blood to meet together to pray or to read the Bible. The 5 Mile Act is produced, which forbids anybody who's ever been a minister of any church who's not part of the Church of England to come within 5 miles of a town or a church that he's pastored before. And it's during this time that, for example, John Bunyan is thrown into jail and Pilgrim's Progress is done. 20,000 Puritans are imprisoned at this particular time. And then finally it all comes to a different end in 1689 when Charles dies, Charles II dies, and James II comes to the throne. But James II is a Catholic, And everybody says, that's not going to happen. We're not going to have a Catholic king. So they depose him, and they go over to Holland, and they bring William and Mary from Orange in Holland. And William and Mary of Orange come over, and you have the Act of Toleration. So now nonconformists are tolerated, but it isn't for years. For example, in 1850, Charles Spurgeon was not, the great preacher, would not have been allowed to go to Oxford or to Cambridge or to any of the major universities because he wasn't an Anglican. And that's the way it was. You had the nonconformists, and they were sort of kept very carefully out of they were dissenters. And so that's a little bit of the history, and that's part of what drove, for example, here in this country. I mean, you had the same thing. The Puritans came, they wanted religious freedom, but they weren't willing to give it to others. So you have the whole Roger Williams episode here of Roger Williams as wanting to have a Baptistic style of church, has to go and leave the colonies and go and to Rhode Island and start his own and so forth. That's part of the early history that this country knows. So, okay, I know that was a slog through history, but let's just see if you've got any observations or questions or things. By the way, I should say this. I didn't mention that in the midst of the Oliver Cromwell years, or at the beginning part, you had the Westminster Assembly in 1660, 1640, in that range. And so you had some very concentrated theological thinking. Out of it came the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Catechism. The Puritans had some profoundly significant theological insights and writings. They're being rediscovered today. It's interesting because having been part of the Gospel Coalition since its beginning, I'm kind of on the edge of it, but there's this hardcore group in the middle who they almost bow down to Puritans. If you name a Puritan, if you can't quote a Puritan in a discussion, you're obviously in great problems in that particular group. And people love the depth of theology and the depth of thoughtfulness, but it was a very different time. Story is told of one preacher who'd been preaching for 7 hours, and he said, I think it's time to quit. And they said, no, go on, brother, go on. And I don't think I can conceive of that in this, in any context today. So, okay, anything that you want to observe or note, we should. Okay, nobody's saying go on. Everybody's saying stop. Okay, so next week we will do the Christmas thing, and don't forget that. I don't know whether that list went around or is it at the back? It's in the back table to look at and sign. So, Father, we do take for granted so many things. And we know we're fighting some of our own battles in this country with Supreme Court cases going on and other things that affect our rights and opportunities. Help us on one hand to be grateful for what we have, but help us never to believe that your work is dependent on what government permits. We thank you for what you have done in history in some of the hardest of times and places to bring out the truth and glory of the gospel. Until Christ comes, help us to be faithful. Amen.